Welcome to her journey, where every story is a testament to the power of perseverance, hope, and the unstoppable spirit of women. Here, we share true tales of resilience and reinvention, stories that prove no matter how dark the night, a woman's dawn can always break through. If you believe in the beauty of comebacks and the power of second chances, you're in the right place. Today, we bring you the extraordinary story of Chantel Morrison, a woman who discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. I stood in the darkness of my daughter's guest room at 3 a.m., my hands trembling as I stuffed my life into 2 suitcases. 72 years old, and here I was, running away like a teenager escaping an abusive home. But the conversation I'd overheard through these thin walls had shattered every illusion I'd held about family, about security, about the golden years I thought I'd earned. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved like a ghost through the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary. Outside, my Uber driver waited in the driveway, headlights cutting through the suburban silence. I was Chantel Morrison, a woman who had raised 3 children, buried a husband she'd loved for 47 years, and had just handed over $750,000 to secure what I believed would be a peaceful retirement. What I discovered instead was that blood doesn't always mean family, and sometimes the people who promise to take care of you are the very ones planning to take everything you have left. If stories of resilience, transformation, and a woman's quiet revenge through success inspire you, please subscribe to her journey and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale that just might change your life. My name is Chantel Morrison, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had life figured out. At 72, I was living in the same split-level ranch in Ohio where Robert and I had raised our 3 children, Jennifer, Michael, and David. The house held 43 years of memories, from first steps in the hallway to graduation parties in the backyard, from Christmas mornings to the quiet afternoon when we brought Robert home from the hospital for the last time. Robert had been gone for 2 years, and the silence in our home had become deafening. Every morning, I'd wake up and reach for him, only to find cold sheets and the lingering scent of his cologne on the pillow I couldn't bring myself to wash. The house felt enormous and empty, filled with echoes of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. I'd been a high school English teacher for 38 years, and Robert had worked his way up from factory floor to plant manager at the local manufacturing company. We'd been careful with our money, modest in our dreams, and had managed to save what felt like a fortune to us, $750,000 between his life insurance, our retirement accounts, and the equity in our home. Jennifer, my youngest at 44, had been calling me twice a week since her father's funeral. "Mom, you can't stay in that big house all alone," she'd say, her voice filled with what I thought was genuine concern. "What if something happens? What if you fall? What if there's an emergency?" She lived in Colorado with her husband, James, and their 2 teenage children, Tyler and Madison. James worked in finance, something lucrative that I never quite understood, and they lived in one of those sprawling suburban developments where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. When Jennifer suggested I sell the Ohio house and move in with them, it felt like an answer to prayers I didn't even know I'd been praying. "We have that whole finished basement," Jennifer had explained during one of our video calls. "It's practically an apartment, Mom. You'd have your own space, your own bathroom, but we'd be right upstairs if you needed anything. And think about the grandkids, they're growing up so fast and they barely know you." The loneliness had been eating at me like a slow poison. Days would pass where the only person I spoke to was the grocery store cashier or the mailman. I'd find myself talking to Robert's photograph, asking him what he thought I should do, but the silence that followed felt like abandonment all over again. Michael lived in California with his wife and twin boys, caught up in the endless cycle of soccer practice and school events. David was in New York, single and focused on his career as a lawyer, visiting maybe twice a year, and calling on birthdays and holidays with the efficiency of someone checking items off a list. But Jennifer had always been my baby, the one who called just to chat, who remembered the stories I'd told her about my childhood, who seemed to understand that losing Robert had left me untethered in a way that surprised me with its intensity. When she painted the picture of me living with them, being part of their daily lives, helping with homework and sharing family dinners, it felt like being offered a lifeline. The decision to sell the house had been agonizing. Every room held memories that felt too precious to abandon. The kitchen where I'd taught all 3 children to cook, the living room where we'd watched countless movies on Friday nights, the bedroom where Robert and I had whispered our dreams and fears into the darkness for nearly 5 decades. But the realtor's enthusiasm had been infectious. "Mrs. Morrison, in this market, a house like this will sell in days, maybe hours. You're sitting on a gold mine." The number she quoted made my head spin. Combined with everything else, I'd have enough money to contribute significantly to Jennifer's household, enough to ensure I wouldn't be a burden, enough to secure my future and maybe leave something meaningful for my grandchildren. The house sold in 3 days. I spent the next month sorting through a lifetime of accumulation, deciding what could fit in a basement apartment and what would have to be donated or discarded. Each box I packed felt like I was dismantling the evidence of a life well lived, reducing 43 years to what could fit in a moving truck. Jennifer had been so excited during our planning calls. "Mom, we're going to redo the whole basement for you. New carpet, fresh paint. We'll make it perfect. James thinks it's wonderful that you're moving in. He says it'll be good for the kids to have their grandmother around, and honestly, Mom, we could use the help with them." I interpreted help as the kind of assistance I dreamed of providing. Picking them up from school, helping with homework, being the kind of grandmother who baked cookies and remembered every school play and soccer game. I imagined Sunday dinners where I'd share stories of their mother's childhood, holiday mornings where I'd be part of the chaos and joy, quiet evenings where Tyler and Madison might actually want to spend time with me instead of disappearing into their phones. The financial arrangement had seemed so straightforward. I would contribute $500,000 toward the mortgage principal, significantly reducing their monthly payments, and keep $250,000 in my own investment account for personal expenses and emergencies. In exchange, I'd have my own space, family around me, and the security of knowing I'd never be alone again. James had handled all the paperwork with the efficiency I'd expected from someone in finance. "Chantel, this is going to be perfect for everyone," he'd said during one of our video calls, his smile warm and reassuring. "Jennifer's been so worried about you, and we really want the kids to have a relationship with their grandmother. Plus, having your contribution toward the mortgage means we can start thinking about some improvements we've been putting off." I trusted them completely. Why wouldn't I? This was my daughter, the child who had crawled into bed with Robert and me during thunderstorms until she was 12, who had called me crying during her first heartbreak, who had asked me to be in the delivery room when both of her children were born. This was the man she'd chosen, the father of my grandchildren, the son-in-law who had always been polite and welcoming during holiday visits. The day I'd wired the money, I'd felt a mixture of excitement and terror. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, and I was handing it over with nothing more than love and trust as collateral. But Jennifer had been so grateful, so emotional on the phone. "Mom, I can't tell you what this means to us. You're going to love it here, and the kids are so excited. Tyler keeps asking when Grandma's moving in." I'd driven away from Ohio with tears streaming down my face, but they'd been bittersweet tears. I was leaving behind the physical remnants of my life with Robert, but I was driving toward what I believed would be a new chapter filled with family, purpose, and belonging. The basement apartment had been lovely, exactly as Jennifer had promised. Fresh paint, new carpet, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom that had been updated with grab bars and non-slip surfaces. They'd even hung some of my favorite photographs on the walls and positioned my reading chair by the small window that looked out into their backyard. For the first month, it had felt like everything I'd hoped for. Jennifer would bring me coffee in the mornings, and we'd sit together talking about her plans for the day. Tyler and Madison were polite if distant, but I told myself that would change with time. James seemed genuinely pleased to have me there, asking about my day and including me in dinner conversations. I'd settled into routines that felt healthy and purposeful. I'd wake up early, make myself breakfast in my little kitchen, then head upstairs to help Jennifer with whatever she needed. Some days, I'd drive Madison to dance class or pick up Tyler from baseball practice. I'd started volunteering at the local library, helping with their literacy program, and had joined a book club filled with women who seemed to understand the peculiar challenges of starting over in your 70s. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. Jennifer seemed increasingly stressed about money, despite the significant reduction in their mortgage payment. James started working longer hours, and when he was home, he seemed preoccupied and distant. I told myself these were normal adjustments, the kind of growing pains any family would experience when adding a new member to the household. I'd lived alone for 2 years. Surely it would take time to remember how to live with others. And they were busy people with demanding careers and active teenagers. I was probably expecting too much too soon. The children's behavior became the first real warning sign. Tyler, who had initially been polite if reserved, started avoiding me altogether. When I'd offer to help with his homework, he'd mumble something about having it handled and disappear to his room. Madison, who had seemed genuinely excited about having me there, became increasingly short with me, rolling her eyes when I'd ask about her day or suggest activities we could do together. "They're just being teenagers, Mom," Jennifer would say when I expressed concern. "You know how kids are at this age. They don't want to hang out with adults, even grandparents they love." But I remembered being a teenager, and I remember my own children at that age. This felt different. This felt like they'd been told something about me that had changed how they saw me, like I'd somehow become an unwelcome presence in their home rather than a beloved family member. The isolation I'd felt in Ohio began creeping back, but this time it was worse because I was surrounded by people who were supposed to love me. I'd given up everything I'd known, sold the home where I'd built my life with Robert, and moved across the country to be part of their family. But increasingly, I felt like an outsider looking in, like someone they were tolerating rather than embracing. Still, I told myself to be patient. Change was hard for everyone, and maybe I was being too sensitive, too needy. Maybe I'd expected too much too soon. Maybe this was just the reality of multi-generational living, and I needed to adjust my expectations and find my place within their established rhythms. I had no idea that the conversation I was about to overhear would shatter every assumption I'd made about family, love, and the people I'd trusted with my life savings and my future. It was a Thursday night in late September, 3 months after I'd moved in, when everything changed. I'd gone to bed early with a book, but sleep wouldn't come. The basement had a way of amplifying sounds from upstairs, something I'd learned to tune out during normal family conversations. But tonight, there was an intensity to the voices that made me pay attention. At first, I couldn't make out individual words, just the rhythm of heated conversation. But then Jennifer's voice rose sharp and clear. "We can't keep pretending this is working, James. She's driving me crazy." I set down my book and held my breath, hoping I'd misheard, hoping they were talking about someone else, something else. But James's response made my blood run cold. "Keep your voice down. She might hear us. She's downstairs reading. Besides, this affects her too, and she needs to understand the reality of the situation." I crept closer to the ceiling, positioning myself directly under what I knew was their kitchen table, the place where they had their most serious conversations. The floorboards above me creaked as someone shifted in their chair. "Jennifer, we talked about this when we agreed to let her move in. You knew it would be an adjustment. An adjustment? Jennifer's laugh was bitter, nothing like the warm sound I'd known my entire life. James, she's not just staying with us. She's taken over. She rearranges my kitchen cabinets. She gives me parenting advice I didn't ask for, and she acts like she has equal say in decisions about our house and our kids. My chest tightened. I thought I'd been helpful, organizing their chaotic kitchen, sharing insights from my years of teaching and parenting. I thought I'd been contributing to their household, not imposing on it. And the money situation is getting complicated, James continued, his voice lower but still audible through the thin ceiling. The financial advisor called today. With the changes in the market and our expanded budget, we're going to need to make some adjustments. What kind of adjustments? Well, we've been treating her contribution like it was a loan, but legally, since she's not on the deed and there's no formal agreement, that money is essentially a gift. If something happened to her, her sons could potentially claim it was a loan and demand repayment from the estate. My hands began to shake. The casual way he discussed if something happened to me made my skin crawl. And the revelation that they'd been treating my contribution as anything other than what we'd agreed upon felt like a betrayal so profound I couldn't process it. So, what are you saying? Jennifer asked. I'm saying we need to protect ourselves and be smart about this situation. She's 72, Jennifer. Statistically, we're probably looking at maybe 10 or 15 years before we're dealing with serious health issues, assisted living, or worse. The clinical coldness in his voice made me nauseous. I wasn't a person to them. I was a financial liability with an expiration date. The way I see it, James continued, we have a few options. We can formalize the arrangement, get her to sign documents that make it clear the money was a gift in exchange for lifetime care, which protects us legally. Or what? The pause that followed felt endless. I pressed my ear closer to the ceiling, dreading what I was about to hear. Or we help her understand that this living situation isn't sustainable long-term, and we start looking at assisted living facilities. If we time it right, her remaining money would cover a decent place for several years, and we'd still have her initial contribution to help with our expenses. The room above me went quiet except for the hum of their refrigerator. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence, could feel my entire world tilting off its axis. James, I can't just kick my mother out. What would that look like? What would Michael and David think? You wouldn't be kicking her out. You'd be helping her transition to a living situation that's more appropriate for someone her age. Think about it, Jennifer. She's already showing signs of being demanding and difficult. What happens in 5 years when she needs real care? Are you prepared to be her full-time caregiver? Are the kids going to want to bring friends home when there's an elderly woman with potential health issues living in the basement? Each word felt like a physical blow. The demanding and difficult behavior he was describing felt like my attempts to be helpful and involved. The health issues he was anticipating weren't based on any actual problems I was having, they were just assumptions about what it meant to be my age. And honestly, he continued, his voice becoming more animated, assisted living might be better for her. She'd have people her own age to socialize with, activities designed for seniors, professional care if she needs it. She might actually be happier. But the money she gave us was for her care, right? Well, assisted living is care. It's just not care provided by us in our home. We use what we need to use for her expenses, and the rest helps us provide for our own family. I sank onto my bed, my legs no longer able to support me. They were discussing my future as if I were a pet they were considering surrendering to a shelter. The money I'd given them, money Robert and I had saved over decades of careful living, was being treated like their personal windfall with the inconvenient attachment of an aging mother. What about the kids? Jennifer asked. They were excited about having Grandma here. James snorted. Jennifer, be honest. The kids avoid her. Tyler complains that she asks too many questions about his homework and his friends. Madison says she feels like she's being watched all the time. They were polite about the idea of having grandma here, but they're teenagers. They don't actually want to spend time with a 72-year-old woman, even if she is their grandmother. The cruelty of this assessment took my breath away. I'd thought I was building relationships with my grandchildren, but apparently, my presence was being discussed as a burden they were all tolerating. So, what's the timeline you're thinking? Jennifer asked, and the resignation in her voice told me she'd already accepted this plan. I think we give it through the holidays. It would look strange to move her out right before Thanksgiving and Christmas. But after the new year, we start looking at places and having conversations about her future needs. And if she resists? Jennifer, she's living in our house, dependent on us for transportation, social connection, everything. She's not in a position to resist. We present it as what's best for her, what's best for everyone. We're her family, and she trusts us to make good decisions. The betrayal I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced, even when Robert died. Death was something that happened to you, something beyond anyone's control. But this was a deliberate deception, a calculated plan to dispose of me now that they had what they wanted. I heard chairs scraping against the floor above me, signaling the end of their conversation. I rushed back to my bed and grabbed my book, trying to look casual in case one of them decided to check on me. But they didn't. I heard them moving around upstairs, getting ready for bed, carrying on with their evening routines as if they hadn't just planned to discard me like an unwanted piece of furniture. I lay in the darkness for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction I'd had with them since moving in. Every suggestion I'd made that they'd politely dismissed, every attempt at family involvement that had been met with subtle resistance, every time I'd felt like I was imposing rather than contributing, it all made sense now. They had never wanted me there. They had wanted my money. The realization that I had no legal recourse was almost as devastating as the emotional betrayal. James was right. I'd given them the money with no formal agreement, trusting that family bonds would be stronger than any contract. I wasn't on the deed to their house. I had no legal standing to demand anything. But more than the money, more than the legal vulnerability, was the profound loneliness of understanding that I truly had no family in the way I'd believed. Jennifer, the daughter I'd thought knew me best, had been discussing me like a problem to be solved. The grandchildren I'd hoped to influence and love apparently saw me as an intrusion in their lives. At 72, I was completely alone in the world, financially vulnerable, and living under the roof of people who were counting the days until they could get rid of me. As I lay there in the darkness, something began to shift inside me. The initial shock and grief were giving way to something else, something harder and more focused. They had underestimated me, treating me like a helpless old woman who would passively accept whatever they decided was best for me. They were about to learn that Chantel Morrison had not survived 72 years, raised 3 children, taught thousands of students, and buried the love of her life by being passive. But first, I had to get out of their house. The next few weeks were the darkest period of my life, darker even than the months after Robert's death. At least then, I'd been surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, who brought casseroles and called to check on me and held my hand during the funeral. Now I was surrounded by people who were actively deceiving me, and every interaction felt like a performance. I became hyper-aware of every conversation, every glance between Jennifer and James, every time Tyler or Madison avoided spending time with me. What I'd previously interpreted as normal family dynamics now felt sinister and calculated. When Jennifer would ask how I'd slept or if I needed anything from the store, I could hear the underlying impatience in her voice. When James would make small talk about my day, I could see him mentally calculating how much longer he'd have to endure these exchanges. The worst part was the pretending. Every morning, I had to come upstairs and act like a grateful mother and grandmother, had to smile and make pleasant conversation with people who were planning to warehouse me in an assisted living facility as soon as it became socially acceptable to do so. I'd call Michael in California, desperate for connection with someone who might actually care about my well-being, but our conversations felt stilted and rushed. He was dealing with his own challenges, his own demanding career and family responsibilities, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd discovered. How do you explain to your son that his sister is planning to steal your life savings and abandon you? How do you admit that you'd been so naive, so desperate for family connection, that you'd handed over everything you had without protecting yourself? David was even less accessible. Always between meetings or traveling for work, our conversations reduced to brief check-ins where he'd ask if I was settling in well with Jennifer and James. The irony of that question became more painful each time he asked it. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the family I'd paid to join going about their lives above me. I'd hear Jennifer and James talking in their bedroom, their voices too low to make out specific words, but the tone always seemed conspiratorial now. I'd hear Tyler and Madison getting ready for school, their voices bright and animated as they discussed their plans with their parents, and I'd wonder if they'd been relieved when they learned I wouldn't be part of their lives much longer. The physical symptoms of stress began manifesting in ways that terrified me. I'd lose my appetite for days at a time, then find myself eating compulsively, standing in my little kitchenette at 2 a.m. consuming whatever comfort food I'd managed to buy during my lonely grocery runs. My sleep became erratic and disturbing, filled with dreams where I was lost in unfamiliar places, calling for help that never came. But worst of all was the self-doubt that began creeping in. Maybe James was right. Maybe I was demanding and difficult. Maybe I had been imposing on their family routines, overstepping boundaries I should have recognized. Maybe assisted living would be better for me. Maybe I was too old, too set in my ways, too needy to be part of a busy family's life. I'd catch glimpses of myself in mirrors and be startled by what I saw, an old woman with gray hair and worried eyes, someone who looked exactly like the burden James had described. When had I become this person? When had I stopped being Chantel Morrison, the teacher who could command a classroom of 30 teenagers, the mother who had raised 3 successful children, the wife who had been Robert's equal partner in every decision? The isolation was suffocating. In Ohio, I'd had neighbors I'd known for decades, former colleagues who'd invite me to lunch, a church community where I'd been active for 40 years. Here, I knew no one except the people who were planning to discard me. The book club I'd joined was pleasant enough, but the relationships were superficial. The library volunteering felt meaningful, but it was only a few hours a week. I'd drive around their suburban neighborhood, looking at the perfect houses with their perfect lawns, wondering if any of the families inside were dealing with the same kind of deception I was experiencing. Did other elderly parents live in basements, financially supporting families who secretly resented their presence? Was this just the reality of aging in America, that your value as a person diminished until you became nothing more than a financial calculation? The holidays were approaching, and the thought of sitting through Thanksgiving and Christmas, pretending to be grateful while knowing it was all an elaborate charade, made me physically ill. I'd picture myself at their dinner table, carving turkey and listening to the children talk about their school activities, all while knowing that James and Jennifer were counting down the days until they could execute their plan. I started researching assisted living facilities online, telling myself I was being practical, that I needed to understand what my future would look like. The websites were cheerful and colorful, full of photos of smiling elderly people playing cards and doing crafts. Active senior living, they called it. Maintenance-free lifestyle. Community designed for your golden years. But when I looked at the costs, my heart sank. Even the most basic facilities were expensive, and the nicer ones would consume my remaining savings within a few years. After that, what? Medicaid? A state-run facility. The gradual erosion of dignity that came with poverty and old age? I'd spent my career teaching literature, helping students understand that stories had meaning, that characters faced challenges and grew from them, that there were always choices even in the darkest circumstances. But I felt like I was trapped in a story where I was nothing more than a supporting character in someone else's narrative, where my choices had been reduced to accepting whatever was decided for me. The worst moment came 3 weeks after I'd overheard their conversation. I was in the kitchen making myself lunch when Jennifer came home from work early. She looked stressed and tired, and when she saw me standing at the counter, something in her expression shifted. "Mom, we need to talk." My heart started pounding. This was it. They decided to move up their timeline. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's just..." She paused, rubbing her temples. "This isn't working the way we thought it would." I waited, knowing that anything I said would probably make the situation worse. "You've been so generous, and we're grateful, but I think maybe we need to consider whether this living arrangement is the best thing for everyone." The words I'd been dreading, delivered with the kind of fake concern that made them even more painful. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe you'd be happier somewhere with people your own age, with activities and social opportunities designed for someone in your stage of life." I stared at her, this woman I'd given birth to, this child I'd loved unconditionally for 44 years, and felt something inside me break completely. "You want me to leave? I want you to be happy, Mom. And I'm not sure you're happy here." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost questioned my own perception of the situation. But then I remembered the conversation I'd overheard, the clinical way James had discussed my future, the casual cruelty with which they'd planned to dispose of me. And my money? Something flickered in her eyes, just for a moment, before the concerned daughter expression returned. "Your money is safe, Mom. We'll make sure you have everything you need. Everything I need, according to their calculations. Not everything I'd earned, not everything I'd contributed, but whatever they decided was sufficient to keep me quiet and manageable." I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the confused old woman who didn't quite understand what was happening to her. "Let me think about it," I said. "Of course. There's no rush. We just want what's best for you." That night, I made my decision. I couldn't stay in their house, pretending to be grateful while they planned my disposal. I couldn't continue to fund their lifestyle while they treated me like an unwelcome houseguest. And I couldn't spend whatever years I had left accepting their version of what my life should look like. But I also couldn't leave empty-handed, allowing them to keep money that was legally and morally mine while I faced an uncertain future with whatever scraps they decided to give me. I was going to disappear. And then I was going to fight back. The plan came to me during one of those sleepless 3 a.m. hours when desperation breeds clarity. I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me, when I realized that everyone was underestimating Chantel Morrison, including myself. James thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman who would passively accept whatever they decided. Jennifer believed she could manipulate me with fake concern and guilty obligation. Even I had started to believe that my age made me powerless, that 72 meant surrendering control of my life to people who claimed to know what was best for me. But I'd forgotten who I was before I became a widow, before I became a burden, before I became someone to be managed rather than respected. I was a woman who had taught high school English for 38 years, who had dealt with manipulative teenagers, demanding parents, and bureaucratic administrators. I was someone who had managed a household budget, raised 3 children, and helped my husband build a life from nothing. I was a person who had read thousands of books, who understood human nature, who knew that knowledge and planning could overcome almost any disadvantage. And I had one crucial advantage that James and Jennifer didn't realize. I knew what they were planning, but they had no idea that I knew. The first step was reconnaissance. I started paying attention to their routines with the focused intensity I'd once applied to lesson planning. James left for work every morning at 7:30. Jennifer left at 8:15 after getting the kids off to school. Tyler had baseball practice most afternoons and Madison had dance class twice a week. They were all gone from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on weekdays, leaving me alone in the house with access to everything. I began systematically photographing documents. James kept a home office where he handled both his work and their personal finances, and his filing system was meticulous. I found copies of bank statements, investment accounts, mortgage documents, and most importantly, records of the transfer I'd made when I moved in. What I discovered was both better and worse than I'd expected. The good news was that there was a clear paper trail showing my contribution to their mortgage principal. The bad news was that James had been right about the legal implications. Without formal documentation, proving that the money was a loan rather than a gift would be challenging. But I also found something else, records of other financial transactions that didn't quite add up. James had been moving money between accounts in ways that suggested he was hiding assets from someone, possibly the IRS, possibly Jennifer, possibly both. There were consulting fees paid to an LLC that seemed to exist only on paper, investment losses that looked suspiciously convenient, and expense reports that included personal purchases disguised as business costs. I photographed everything, uploading the images to a cloud storage account I created specifically for this purpose. If James wanted to play games with money and legal documentation, I was going to make sure I had ammunition. The second step was establishing my independence. I couldn't make my move while I was completely dependent on them for transportation and social connection. I started taking Uber rides to explore the city, learning the bus routes, identifying neighborhoods where I might want to live. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, using my Social Security payments and a small portion of my remaining savings to establish financial autonomy. I also started building relationships outside of their household. The library where I volunteered became my refuge, and I began forming genuine friendships with other volunteers. There was Susan, a retired nurse who was dealing with her own family challenges, and Patricia, a former social worker who understood the complexities of aging parents and adult children. I didn't tell them everything, but I began testing the waters, sharing carefully edited versions of my situation, and listening to their responses. "You know, Chantel," Susan said one afternoon as we sorted donated books, "I've seen this story before. Adult children who think they know what's best for their parents, who forget that being older doesn't mean being incompetent." Patricia nodded. The financial abuse of elderly people is more common than most people realize. And it's often family members who are the perpetrators. These conversations were like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating. They reminded me that my perceptions weren't distorted by age or bitterness, that what was happening to me was recognizable to people who understood family dynamics and elder care. The third step was research. I spent hours at the library computer, learning about my legal rights, tenant protections, and financial recovery options. I discovered that Colorado had strong laws protecting elderly people from financial exploitation, and that there were legal aid organizations specifically designed to help people in my situation. I also researched James's business, using online tools to investigate the company he worked for and the consulting LLC I'd found in his files. What I discovered was fascinating. His employer had been involved in a scandal the previous year related to financial misconduct, and several employees had been terminated or had resigned under suspicious circumstances. James's consulting business appeared to be a way of continuing to receive money from clients who couldn't officially work with his employer. But the most important research was about myself. I started making lists of my skills, my experience, my resources. I wasn't just a 72-year-old woman with health concerns and limited options. I was an educated professional with decades of experience managing people and projects. I had nearly $250,000 in assets that were legally mine. I had no significant health problems and could reasonably expect to live independently for many more years. The final step was timing. I needed to leave while they still believed they were in control, before they started the process of moving me to assisted living, and at a moment when my disappearance would create maximum disruption to their plans. The opportunity came in mid-November. James had a business trip scheduled, Tyler had an away game that would keep them out overnight, and Madison was staying with a friend for the weekend. It would just be Jennifer and me in the house, and she'd mentioned that she planned to spend Saturday with her sister, who was visiting from Denver. On Friday afternoon, I told Jennifer that I wasn't feeling well and would probably spend the weekend resting in my room. She seemed relieved that she wouldn't have to worry about entertaining me during her sister's visit. That night, I waited until I heard her go to bed, then began the most important packing of my life. I couldn't take much without arousing suspicion, just 2 suitcases with essentials. Important documents, medications, enough clothes for a few weeks, and the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother. Everything else would have to be sacrificed in the name of freedom. The hardest items to pack were the photographs. I couldn't take the albums, but I selected a few precious pictures. My wedding photo, pictures of my children when they were small and still loved me unconditionally, a photo of Robert and me taken on our 40th anniversary. Each one felt like I was choosing which memories I was allowed to keep. At 2:30 a.m., I called for an Uber. The driver was a young woman who asked if I was okay when she saw me loading suitcases in the dark. "I'm leaving," I told her simply. "I'm 72 years old, and I'm running away from home." She smiled. "Good for you." The airport hotel I'd chosen was anonymous and functional, exactly what I needed for the next phase of my plan. I checked in under my own name, using my new debit card, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. I left Jennifer a note, brief and polite. "I've decided to explore other living options. I'll be in touch soon." I didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't give them any information they could use to track me down or manipulate me into returning. As I sat in that generic hotel room, surrounded by the remnants of my old life, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert died. Possibility. For the first time in months, my future wasn't being decided by other people. I was terrified, but I was also free. The next morning, I called Patricia from the library and asked if we could meet for coffee. When I told her everything, she listened without judgment, her social worker instincts kicking in. "Chantel, what they did to you is financial elder abuse, and it's illegal. You have options, but you're goy." "I don't want revenge," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "I just want my life back." "Those might end up being the same thing." She gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in elder law, and we made an appointment for Monday morning. She also connected me with a social worker who helped elderly people transition to independent living, and with a financial advisor who understood the complexities of rebuilding after financial exploitation. For the first time since I'd overheard that terrible conversation, I wasn't just reacting to what other people had planned for me. I was making plans of my own. The attorney's office was in downtown Denver, in one of those glass towers that made me feel small and intimidated. But Rebecca Chen, the lawyer Patricia had recommended, was nothing like the intimidating legal eagle I'd expected. She was probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and a manner that was both professional and genuinely warm. "Mrs. Morrison," she said after I'd told her my story, "I want you to understand something important. What happened to you is unfortunately common, but it's not something you have to accept." She explained the legal concept of financial elder abuse and how Colorado law provided protections that I could invoke. The challenge would be proving that my contribution to their mortgage was a loan rather than a gift, but the fact that I'd moved in with them with the understanding that I'd be cared for in exchange for the money created what she called consideration that might change the legal interpretation. "The documentation you gathered is extremely helpful," she said, reviewing the photographs I'd taken of James's financial records. "And some of these other transactions you uncovered raise questions that go beyond your personal situation." She recommended a forensic accountant who could help untangle the financial aspects of my case, and she suggested that our first step should be a formal demand letter, requesting documentation of how my money had been used and demanding either my inclusion in the house's ownership or the return of my contribution. This isn't just about getting your money back, she explained. This is about establishing that you're not someone who can be taken advantage of. The forensic accountant was a revelation. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a former FBI financial crimes investigator who now worked as a private consultant, and she approached my situation with the thoroughness of a criminal investigation. "Mrs. Morrison, your son-in-law has been very busy," she said after reviewing the documents. "These consulting payments? They're coming from companies that were involved in the scandal at his previous employer. The timing suggests he might be receiving payments for information or services that his current employer wouldn't approve of." More importantly, she found evidence that James had been systematically underreporting income and creating false business expenses. This level of financial manipulation suggests someone who's comfortable bending rules when it serves his purposes. Your situation probably isn't the first time he's taken advantage of someone's trust. Armed with this information, Rebecca sent a demand letter that was far more comprehensive than anything James had probably expected. We weren't just asking for my money back. We were raising questions about his entire financial structure and suggesting that federal agencies might be interested in his business practices. His response came within 48 hours, which told us everything we needed to know about how seriously he was taking our allegations. The phone call came to my hotel room on a Wednesday evening. Jennifer's voice was strained and angry, nothing like the concerned daughter persona she'd been maintaining. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing? James is furious. You can't just make accusations like this." "I'm not making accusations, Jennifer. I'm asking questions about my money and how it's been used." "Your money? Mom, you gave us that money. You can't just change your mind because you're having second thoughts about living here." The ease with which she lied to me was breathtaking. She either genuinely believed her own revision of events, or she was a more skilled manipulator than I'd ever imagined. "Jennifer, I moved in with you under the understanding that I was contributing to the household in exchange for being part of the family. Instead, I discovered that you were planning to put me in assisted living as soon as it became convenient." The silence that followed was telling. "How did you? We never said anything like that." "I heard you. I heard both of you discussing my future, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved." "Mom, you're confused. You're taking things out of context. I'm 72, Jennifer, not senile. I know what I heard, and I know what it meant." The conversation deteriorated quickly after that, with Jennifer alternating between attempts to gaslight me and threats about what would happen if I continued with my ridiculous legal action. By the time she hung up, I was shaking, but I was also more determined than ever. Meanwhile, I was building a new life with the kind of methodical planning that had served me well as a teacher. The social worker Patricia had connected me with helped me find a one-bedroom apartment in a building that catered to active seniors. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine, and the rent was reasonable enough that I could afford it indefinitely with my Social Security and investment income. I enrolled in a community college Spanish class, something I'd always wanted to do, but had never had time for. I joined a hiking group for seniors, discovering that my years of walking through Ohio neighborhoods had kept me in better shape than I'd realized. I started volunteering with a literacy organization that helped immigrant families, using my teaching skills in a way that felt meaningful and necessary. Most importantly, I began forming friendships with people who knew me as Chantel, not as someone's mother or grandmother or burden. These were relationships based on who I was now, not who I'd been or who other people thought I should be. The legal process moved slowly, but steadily. James hired his own attorney, but the strategy they chose was telling. Instead of disputing the facts of what had happened, They focused on character assassination, portraying me as a confused elderly woman who was being manipulated by unscrupulous lawyers. This approach backfired spectacularly when Dr. Martinez uncovered additional evidence of James's financial misconduct. The consulting payments weren't just ethically questionable, they appeared to violate his employment contract and possibly federal regulations about conflicts of interest. "Mrs. Morrison," Rebecca said during one of our meetings, "I think it's time to discuss settlement options. Your son-in-law is in a much more vulnerable position than he initially realized." The settlement negotiations were surreal. James, who had once discussed my future with the casual authority of someone deciding what to do with an unwanted pet, was now desperate to avoid the kind of scrutiny that might expose his other financial activities. But the most difficult part wasn't dealing with James. It was navigating my relationship with Jennifer. She called periodically, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes attempting to restore the loving daughter persona that might convince me to drop my legal action. "Mom, this is destroying our family. Tyler and Madison don't understand why their grandmother is trying to hurt their father." "I'm not trying to hurt anyone, Jennifer. I'm trying to protect myself." "Protect yourself? From what? We gave you a home. We took care of you. You gave me a basement apartment in exchange for $500,000, and then you planned to move me to assisted living as soon as you could do it without looking like monsters." "We never. That's not what we were planning." The lies came so easily to her that I began to wonder if she'd convinced herself they were true. Maybe it was easier for her to believe that I was the problem rather than acknowledge what she'd been willing to do to her own mother. The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez discovered that James had been using my contribution to their mortgage to leverage additional borrowing, essentially using my money as collateral for investments I'd never agreed to. This wasn't just financial elder abuse, it was fraud. Armed with this evidence, Rebecca was able to negotiate a settlement that recovered not just my initial contribution, but additional damages for the unauthorized use of my money. More importantly, we negotiated terms that prevented James and Jennifer from making any future claims on my assets or attempting to interfere with my living situation. But money was only part of what I'd lost, and only part of what I was working to rebuild. The deeper challenge was reconstructing my sense of self, figuring out who Chantel Morrison was when she wasn't defined by her relationships to other people. The Spanish class became a metaphor for this larger project. Learning a new language at 72 was challenging, but it was also exhilarating. Every new verb conjugation, every successful conversation with my teacher, every moment when I understood something I hadn't understood the day before, was proof that I was still capable of growth and change. The hiking group introduced me to landscapes I'd never seen and physical challenges I'd never attempted. The first time I completed a 5-mile trail, I called Patricia from the summit to share my excitement with someone who would understand what the achievement meant. "You know what this is, don't you?" she said. "This is you discovering that your life isn't over just because your circumstances changed." She was right. For months, I'd been living as if my story was ending, as if being widowed and aging meant accepting whatever role other people assigned to me. But standing on that mountain, looking out at a view I'd earned through my own effort, I realized that I was still writing my story. The legal settlement was finalized on a cold February morning, almost a year after I'd moved to Colorado. As I signed the documents that officially closed this chapter of my life, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I'd won, but winning had cost me relationships with people I'd loved, even if that love hadn't been returned in the way I'd hoped. But I'd also gained something invaluable, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd believed, more resilient than anyone had given me credit for, and capable of building a life that was entirely my own. The money from the settlement gave me more than financial security. It gave me choices. For the first time since Robert died, I wasn't making decisions based on fear or desperation or the need to accommodate other people's expectations. I was making decisions based on what I wanted my life to look like. The first major decision was about where to live. My apartment was comfortable, but it was temporary, a place to recover rather than a place to thrive. I spent weeks exploring different neighborhoods, not just in Denver, but in other cities, other states, other possibilities. I visited Michael in California, staying in a hotel rather than imposing on his family, and spent a week getting to know the grandchildren I'd seen only during brief holiday visits. Without the pressure of being the pathetic elderly mother who needed to be managed, our interactions were different. We were adults spending time together by choice rather than obligation. "Mom," Michael said during one of our dinners, "you seem different, happier." "I feel different," I told him. "I feel like myself again." He asked about the situation with Jennifer and James, and I gave him the abbreviated version, focusing on the outcome rather than the details of their betrayal. He was angry on my behalf, but not surprised. "Jennifer always thought she knew what was best for everyone," he said. "Even when we were kids, she'd reorganize our rooms and get mad when we didn't appreciate her improvements." It was a revelation to hear him describe patterns I'd never recognized, to understand that my experience with Jennifer wasn't an anomaly created by my age and vulnerability, but part of a longer history of her need to control other people's lives. I also visited David in New York, approaching the trip with the same independence I'd shown in California. We met for dinner in Manhattan, and I told him about my legal victory with the pride of someone who'd fought a difficult battle and won. "Jesus, Mom, I had no idea. Why didn't you call me when all this was happening?" "Because I needed to figure out if I could handle it myself." "And could you?" "Obviously." He laughed, and I realized he was seeing me as a person rather than a problem for the first time in years. "You know, I never thought of you as particularly fierce, but apparently I was wrong." "Your father knew," I said. "Robert always said I was tougher than I looked." These conversations with my sons helped me understand something important. The version of myself I'd become in Jennifer's house wasn't who I really was. It was who I became when I was dependent and grateful and trying to fit into a space that was too small for me. But the most significant revelation came through my volunteer work with the literacy organization. I'd been helping Maria, a woman from Guatemala who was learning English while working 2 jobs and raising 3 children. Her determination reminded me of myself at that age, juggling teaching and motherhood and household management with the kind of relentless energy that comes from having no other choice. "Chantel," she said one afternoon as we worked through a difficult grammar lesson, "you are a good teacher. Why you no teach anymore?" The question stopped me cold. Why wasn't I teaching anymore? I'd retired because that's what people did at 65, and then Robert had gotten sick, and then I'd become a widow, and somehow I'd accepted that my professional life was over. But Maria was right. I was a good teacher. I'd always been a good teacher. And there was no reason that had to be past tense. I started researching opportunities to return to education, not as a full-time high school teacher, but in ways that matched my current life and interests. I discovered programs that trained literacy volunteers to work with adult learners, community colleges that needed adjunct instructors for basic writing courses, and organizations that provided educational support for elderly immigrants. Within 6 months, I was teaching again, not just helping individual students, but developing curriculum and training other volunteers. It was different from my years in traditional classrooms, but it was also better in many ways. I was working with people who chose to be there, who were motivated by necessity and hope rather than compelled by law to sit in my classroom. The work reminded me of skills I'd forgotten I had. I could command a room, could break down complex concepts into manageable pieces, could inspire people to believe they were capable of more than they'd imagined. These weren't age-dependent abilities. They were professional skills I developed over decades and could continue to use for as long as I was mentally sharp and physically able. But the most profound change was in how I saw myself and my future. Instead of thinking about my remaining years as a process of gradual decline punctuated by losses, I started thinking about them as an opportunity to do things I'd never had time for when I was younger. I enrolled in an intensive Spanish program at the community college, not just taking individual classes, but committing to becoming fluent. I joined a hiking club that organized trips to national parks, and I started planning adventures I'd always assumed were for younger people. I began writing again, not just journal entries, but actual projects, essays about aging and independence, stories based on my students' experiences, letters to editors about issues affecting elderly people. Most importantly, I started speaking publicly about financial elder abuse, sharing my story at community meetings and legal conferences and support groups. The first time I told my story to a room full of strangers, I was terrified, but their response was overwhelming. "You saved my life," one woman told me afterward. I'm in almost the exact same situation with my daughter, and I thought I was losing my mind. These speaking engagements led to other opportunities. Consulting with law firms that handled elder abuse cases, working with social service agencies to develop prevention programs, and eventually writing articles for national publications about the intersection of aging, family dynamics, and financial vulnerability. Each new project, each public appearance, each time someone thanked me for helping them understand they weren't alone, reinforced a truth I'd almost forgotten. I had valuable knowledge and experience to share. My age wasn't something that diminished my value. It was something that gave me credibility and perspective that younger people couldn't provide. The legal victory had recovered my money, but this professional renaissance recovered something more important: my sense of purpose and my confidence in my own judgment. 2 years after leaving Jennifer's house in the middle of the night, I was living in a condo I'd purchased in a vibrant neighborhood near downtown Denver. I had a work schedule that included teaching, writing, and speaking engagements. I had friends who knew me as Chantel the educator and advocate, not Chantel the vulnerable elderly mother. Most importantly, I had a relationship with myself that wasn't defined by other people's needs or expectations. I could eat dinner at 10 p.m. if I wanted to. I could travel on impulse, spend money on experiences rather than necessities, and make plans based on my own interests rather than other people's schedules. But the real test of my transformation came when Jennifer called, 18 months after the settlement, with news that she and James were getting divorced. "Mom," she said, her voice smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard since she was a child, "I need help. I don't know what to do." The old Chantel would have immediately offered to come help, would have dropped everything to rescue her daughter from the consequences of her own choices. The new Chantel listened with compassion, but also with boundaries. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Jennifer. Divorce is always difficult. Mom, I made some mistakes. About the money, about how he treated you. James convinced me that we were doing what was best for everyone, but I can see now that we were wrong." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from her, and I appreciated it even as I recognized its limitations. She was sorry because her circumstances had changed, not because she understood what she'd done to me. I appreciate you saying that. I was wondering, I know this is a lot to ask, but I'm going to need to find a new place to live, and the kids are having a hard time with everything. Is there any way could I come stay with you for a while? Just until I get back on my feet. The request was so audacious that I almost laughed. The woman who had planned to warehouse me in assisted living was now asking if she could move in with me. "Jennifer, I don't think that would be good for either of us." "But Mom, I'm your daughter. I need help. You are my daughter and I love you. But I'm not in a position to provide the kind of help you're asking for." "What do you mean?" "You have plenty of space, and the settlement gave you back all that money." And there it was, the same sense of entitlement to my resources that had created our original problem. She still saw my money, my space, my life as assets that should be available to solve her problems. "Jennifer, I have a life here. I have work, I have commitments, I have a routine that works for me. You're welcome to visit, but I'm not going to recreate the living situation that didn't work before." The conversation that followed was difficult but clarifying. Jennifer was angry that I wouldn't help her, couldn't understand why I was being selfish in her time of need. She accused me of punishing her for mistakes she'd admitted, of prioritizing my independence over family loyalty. But I'd learned something crucial during my journey back to myself. Love doesn't require self-sacrifice, and family obligations don't trump personal boundaries. I could love Jennifer without rescuing her. I could be her mother without being her solution. When we hung up, I felt sad but not guilty. I'd offered emotional support, practical advice about resources that might help her, and the promise that our relationship could be rebuilt if she was willing to respect my autonomy. But I wasn't going to light myself on fire to keep her warm, especially not when she'd already shown me how little my comfort mattered to her. That night, I looked around my condo, at the books I'd chosen, the art I'd purchased, the space I'd created entirely according to my own preferences, and felt a deep satisfaction. This was what winning looked like. Not just recovering from betrayal, but building something better than what you'd lost. 3 years after that desperate midnight escape from Jennifer's house, I was standing at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional subcommittee about financial elder abuse. The room was filled with legislators, advocates, and journalists, all listening as I explained how easily intelligent, educated elderly people could be manipulated by family members they trusted. The assumption that age makes us vulnerable is often what makes us vulnerable, I told them. When we accept that turning 70 means surrendering our autonomy, we create the conditions for our own exploitation. The testimony was part of my work with the National Coalition for Elder Justice, an organization I joined as both an advocate and a board member. My story had become a case study in their training materials, and my speaking engagements had evolved from local support groups to national conferences. But the real measure of my transformation wasn't the public recognition. It was the private moments when I realized how completely my life had changed. Like the morning I woke up in my condo and remembered that I was leaving that afternoon for a 2-week hiking trip in Peru, something I'd dreamed about for decades but had never believed was possible. At 75, I was in the best physical condition of my adult life, and I was traveling with a group of women I'd met through my advocacy work, all of us proving that adventure doesn't have an expiration date. Or the evening I spent helping Maria, my former literacy student, prepare for her citizenship test. She was now working as a teacher's aide and had invited me to her daughter's high school graduation. "You changed my life," she told me, but the truth was that she'd changed mine too, showing me that teaching could be about more than curriculum and grades. The work I was doing felt more meaningful than anything I'd accomplished during my traditional career. The articles I'd written about elder abuse had been published in major magazines and had generated thousands of emails from people sharing their own stories. The consulting work I did with law firms was helping other elderly people recover assets and dignity. The training programs I'd developed were being used by social service agencies across the country. But perhaps the most satisfying project was the book I'd written about my experience. Never Too Late, Reclaiming Your Life After Family Betrayal, had been published by a major publisher and was being used in social work schools and elder law programs. The advance in royalties had given me more financial security than I'd ever imagined, but more importantly, the book was reaching people who needed to know they weren't alone. The success of the book led to speaking opportunities I'd never expected. I'd been interviewed on national television programs, invited to keynote conferences, and asked to consult on documentaries about aging in America. Each platform gave me the chance to challenge assumptions about what it meant to be elderly, to advocate for policies that protected vulnerable adults, and to inspire people to see their later years as a time of possibility rather than decline. The financial recovery from my legal settlement had been significant, but the broader success of my advocacy work had made me genuinely wealthy for the first time in my life. I was earning more money in my 70s than I'd ever earned as a teacher, and I was doing work that felt more important than anything I'd done before. But the real triumph wasn't professional or financial. It was personal. I'd not only survived betrayal and rebuilt my life, I'd created something better than what I'd lost. The relationship with my sons had deepened in ways I hadn't expected. Michael and David had both expressed pride in what I'd accomplished, but more importantly, they'd started seeking my advice on career decisions and life choices. They saw me as someone with wisdom worth consulting rather than someone whose opinions were irrelevant due to age. "Mom," David said during one of our regular phone calls, "I've been thinking about making a career change, and I wanted to run it by you." These conversations felt different from the dutiful check-ins of earlier years. They were asking for my perspective because they valued my judgment, not because they felt obligated to include me in their lives. Even my relationship with my grandchildren had improved, probably because I was no longer desperate for their affection. Tyler, now in college, had read my book for a sociology class and had called to tell me how proud he was of what I'd accomplished. Madison, finishing high school, had asked if she could interview me for a project about women's rights. These interactions happened on my terms, based on mutual interest rather than artificial family obligations. They were better relationships because they were chosen rather than imposed. The most complicated relationship remained the one with Jennifer. We spoke occasionally, usually when she needed advice about navigating her divorce or managing as a single mother. I'd helped her find legal representation and had offered emotional support during the most difficult periods, but I'd maintained clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't do. She'd never fully acknowledged the depth of what she'd done to me, and I'd accepted that she probably never would. But she'd also never again made assumptions about my availability or my resources, and our conversations had developed a respect that hadn't existed before. The divorce had been difficult for her, but she'd found work as a school administrator and was building an independent life. James had moved to another state, apparently to avoid some of the scrutiny that my legal action had generated. From what I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, his consulting business had collapsed after clients learned about his ethical issues. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles, but I also felt no guilt. The consequences he was experiencing were the result of his own choices, not my decision to protect myself. The real vindication came in unexpected moments, like the day I received a LinkedIn message from Tyler's baseball coach from 3 years earlier. "Mrs. Morrison, I don't know if you remember me, but I wanted you to know that Tyler told our team about what you've accomplished. He said you taught him that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and that being older doesn't mean being weak. I thought you should know that your grandson is proud of you, and that he's been sharing your story with other people." Or the afternoon when I was shopping for groceries and encountered a woman I'd spoken with at a community meeting about elder abuse 2 years earlier. "You probably don't remember me," she said, "but I heard you speak about your experience with your daughter. I wanted to thank you. I was in a similar situation with my son, and your story gave me the courage to get legal help. I got my money back, and more importantly, I got my life back." These encounters reminded me that my story had ripple effects beyond my own recovery. Every time I spoke publicly, every article I wrote, every interview I gave was potentially reaching someone who needed to know that they had options, that age didn't mean powerlessness, that family loyalty didn't require self-destruction. The congressional testimony had been particularly meaningful because it represented the culmination of my transformation from victim to advocate. Standing in that room, surrounded by people who could change policies and create protections for vulnerable elderly people, I'd felt the full power of my voice and my experience. Elder abuse is not just a family problem, I'd told the subcommittee. It's a societal problem that requires systemic solutions. We need laws that protect elderly people's assets, education that helps families understand healthy boundaries, and cultural change that values elderly people's autonomy rather than assuming they need to be managed. The questions that followed had been thoughtful and engaged, and several legislators had asked for follow-up meetings to discuss specific policy proposals. It was the kind of influence I'd never imagined having, the ability to potentially change laws and protect people I'd never meet. But the moment that felt most like complete victory was smaller and more personal. I was having dinner at my favorite restaurant with Patricia and Susan, the friends who had supported me through the darkest period of my journey. We were celebrating Patricia's birthday, and as we laughed about something silly one of us had said, I realized that this was what happiness looked like. Good friends, meaningful work, financial security, and the freedom to make choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. You know, Susan said, raising her wine glass, when you first started volunteering at the library, you seemed so sad and lost. Look at you now. I looked around the restaurant, at the life I'd built entirely through my own efforts, at the friends I'd chosen, at the future I was creating one decision at a time. I never thought I'd say this, I admitted, but losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. Why? Patricia asked. Because it forced me to discover who I was when I wasn't being who other people wanted me to be. It was true. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had actually liberated me from a life that was too small, too dependent, too defined by other people's needs. I'd been given the chance to rebuild from scratch, and I'd built something magnificent. Now, as I write this story at 78, I'm sitting in my home office in the condo I bought with money I earned through my own work after age 72. On the wall behind me hangs a framed photo from my recent trip to Machu Picchu, surrounded by my hiking group of adventurous women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Next to it is a letter from a reader in Florida who credited my book with saving her life, and a certificate recognizing my advocacy work from the American Bar Association. This morning, I received an email from a producer asking if I'd be interested in consulting on a documentary about elder abuse, and this afternoon, I have a video call with a law firm in Seattle that wants my help with a case remarkably similar to my own. Tomorrow, I'm driving to Colorado Springs to speak at a conference for social workers, and next week, I leave for a 2-month writing residency in New Mexico, where I'll be working on my second book. My calendar is full, my bank account is healthy, and my life is entirely my own. But the true measure of what I've accomplished isn't in my achievements or my financial recovery. It's in the letters I receive from people who heard my story and found the courage to change their own lives. It's in the phone calls from women who are facing similar situations and need to know that survival is possible. It's in the policy changes that have been implemented partly because of testimony I've given. The ripple effects of standing up for myself have reached further than I ever imagined. The book has been translated into 6 languages and is being used in elder care programs around the world. The legal strategies my attorney developed to recover my assets have become a template that other lawyers use in similar cases. The advocacy organization I help lead has grown from a small coalition to a national movement with chapters in 40 states. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy is the conversations I've had with my own grandchildren as they've grown into young adults. Tyler is now in graduate school studying social work, partly inspired by what he learned about advocacy through my experience. Madison is majoring in business with a focus on ethical financial practices, and she's written papers about elder abuse for her classes. Grandma, Madison said during our last video call, I used to think getting old meant becoming weak and dependent. You taught me that it can mean becoming powerful in a completely different way. These conversations remind me that my story isn't just about my own recovery. It's about changing how the next generation thinks about aging, autonomy, and family responsibility. The relationship with my sons has evolved into something richer and more mutual than it was when I was younger. They call for advice. They share their career challenges and successes. They include me in their decision-making not because they feel obligated to, but because they value my perspective. Michael recently asked me to help him navigate a difficult situation with his employer, and David consulted me before making a major investment. These aren't the kinds of conversations you have with someone you see as declining or irrelevant. They're the conversations you have with someone whose judgment you respect and whose experience you value. Even the relationship with Jennifer has found a healthier equilibrium. We talk every few months, usually at my initiation, and our conversations are cordial, if not intimate. She's built a successful career and seems to have learned from the mistakes that nearly destroyed our relationship. She's never fully apologized for what she did, but she's also never again presumed that my resources should be available to solve her problems. Last year, she called to tell me that she'd started volunteering with an organization that helps elderly people navigate financial decisions, and she mentioned that my book had influenced her decision to get involved. I realized I needed to understand better what it feels like to be in that position, she said. I want to make sure other families don't make the mistakes we made. It wasn't the apology I'd once hoped for, but it was something perhaps more valuable. Evidence that she'd learned something from our experience and was trying to use that knowledge to help other people. The most surprising aspect of this chapter of my life has been the discovery that my 70s and now my late 70s have been more exciting, more productive, and more fulfilling than any previous decade. I've traveled more, earned more, influenced more positive change, and felt more authentically myself than I ever did when I was younger. People often ask me if I regret the years I lost to my first retirement, the time I spent being the conventional widow who accepted that her active life was over. But I don't see those years as lost. They were part of the journey that led me to where I am now, and without that experience of loss and betrayal, I might never have discovered how much strength I actually possessed. The loneliness I felt after Robert died was real and devastating, but it taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely. Now I'm often alone by choice, and I'm rarely lonely because I've built a life filled with purpose and genuine connections. I think about Robert often, especially when I'm facing a new challenge or celebrating a success. I imagine he would be amazed by the woman I've become, proud of the way I fought back when I was cornered, and perhaps a little surprised that the quiet English teacher he married turned out to have such a fierce streak. You always were tougher than you looked, I can almost hear him saying, and I think he would have loved the adventures I've had, the places I've seen, the difference I've made in other people's lives. But I also know that this version of myself might not have emerged if he'd lived, if I'd remained safely partnered and protected. Sometimes it takes loss to reveal what we're capable of becoming. The financial settlement that started as recovery of stolen assets has grown into genuine wealth through my writing, speaking, and consulting work. I've established a foundation that provides legal assistance to elderly people facing financial abuse, and I've endowed scholarships for students studying elder law and gerontology. But more than money, I've accumulated experiences that feel like treasures. Hiking in Patagonia at 76, learning to speak fluent Spanish, seeing my book displayed in bookstore windows, receiving standing ovations from audiences who understand that my story is also their story. I've learned that reinvention isn't just for the young, that courage can develop at any age, and that sometimes the most important chapters of your life are the ones you write when everyone assumes your story is nearly over. The woman who fled Jennifer's house in the middle of the night with 2 suitcases and a broken heart couldn't have imagined the life I'm living now. She was focused on survival, on protecting what little she had left. She couldn't see that losing everything she thought she needed would create space for everything she actually wanted. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her that the darkness she was entering wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of her liberation. I would tell her that the people who betrayed her were giving her an unexpected gift, the chance to discover who she really was when she wasn't trying to be who they wanted her to be. I would tell her that 72 isn't too late to start over, that there are adventures and achievements and friendships waiting that she can't even imagine, that the best parts of her life might still be ahead of her. And I would tell her what I now know with absolute certainty, that she is stronger than anyone believes, including herself, and that the strength she's about to discover will not only save her life, but will change the lives of countless other people who need to know that resistance is possible, that dignity can be reclaimed, and that age is not surrender. Today, when people ask me about retirement, I tell them I've never been more professionally engaged. When they ask about my family, I tell them I've learned to distinguish between relatives and people who actually love me. When they ask about my health, I tell them I'm in the best shape of my adult life. When they ask about my finances, I tell them I'm wealthier than I ever dreamed possible. But when they ask about my happiness, I tell them something more important. I tell them that I've learned the difference between being happy and being free, and that I choose freedom every time. The house I thought I needed, the family approval I craved, the security I believed came from other people's protection, all of it was a cage I'd built around myself. Breaking free was terrifying, but it was also the most important thing I've ever done. I am Chantel Morrison. I am 78 years old. I am a survivor, an advocate, an author, an adventurer, and a woman who proves every day that it's never too late to rewrite your story. Thank you for joining us for this extraordinary story of courage and transformation. If Chantel's journey moved you, please subscribe to her journey for more real tales of women rising from the ashes. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to rewrite your own story. What's the comeback you dream of? What would you do if you discovered that the people you trusted most were planning to discard you? How would you rebuild if you lost everything you thought you needed? Let us know in the comments, and remember, your true story is just getting started. Age is not the end of possibility. It's the beginning of a different kind of power. And sometimes, losing everything is the only way to discover who you really are. Subscribe, share, and keep writing your own story of resilience. We'll see you in the next video.